Welcome back to Creepy Corner Stories, where the darkness always finds a way in, even during the brightest of holidays. Tonight, we begin our special series of Christmas horror stories, unwrapping tales of terror lurking behind the tinsel and twinkling lights. Because in the stillness of silent nights, not all is calm, and not all is bright. This is Creepy Corner Stories, where every corner hides a secret, and tonight's story is a gift you may regret opening. Let's begin. It was December 24th, 1995, and a small family in rural Oregon was preparing for their traditional Christmas Eve. The snowstorm outside was fierce, isolating the house in a thick blanket of white. The Carter family, Mary Ann, her husband Tom, and their two children, 10-year-old Sarah and 7-year-old Jake, were enjoying a quiet night together. The children were excited for Santa's arrival, their stockings already hung by the fireplace. As the storm intensified, they heard a faint knock at the front door. Tom frowned, looking out the window. The road leading to their home was completely covered, and their driveway hadn't been shoveled since the morning. No one should have been able to make it up there. "Maybe it's just the wind," Mary Ann said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. But then it came again. 3 deliberate knocks, slow, measured. Tom grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man in a thick coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. His breath came out in heavy clouds and he looked frozen to the bone. "Please," the man said in a raspy voice. "I'm lost. The storm. Can I come in?" Tom hesitated. Something about the man seemed off. But it was Christmas Eve, and leaving someone outside in that weather felt wrong. Mary Ann gave him a nod, and Tom stepped aside to let the man in. The stranger didn't say much as he stepped into the warm house. He kept his hood up, muttering his thanks and rubbing his hands together. His fingers were unnaturally long, with nails that looked like they hadn't been trimmed in months. Mary Ann offered him a blanket and some hot cocoa, which he accepted with a strange smile, too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. Sarah and Jake peeked at him from behind the couch, their excitement turning into nervous giggles. "Are you Santa?" Jake asked innocently. The man chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill through the room. "Not quite," he said, his voice like gravel. "But I do bring gifts." Mary Ann forced a polite smile. "Where were you headed? Maybe we can call someone for you." "No need," the man said quickly, his head snapping toward her. "I'll just rest here for a while until the storm lets up." Tom and Mary Ann exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't argue. The man sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The family tried to resume their evening, but the festive mood had vanished. The stranger's presence felt like a shadow over the room. Hours passed and the storm raged on. The children had gone to bed, and Mary Ann whispered to Tom, "I don't feel right about him staying here." Tom nodded. "I'll tell him he can sleep in the barn. It's warm enough and he'll be out of the house." When Tom suggested this to the stranger, the man's smile faded. "The barn," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Yes, that will do." He rose from his chair, and for the first time, Tom noticed how tall he was. His head nearly brushed the ceiling. The stranger didn't wait for directions. He walked straight out the door, disappearing into the snow without a word. Relieved, Tom locked the door and checked on the kids. They were sound asleep, their stockings hanging full and ready for the morning. But when he returned to the living room, he froze. The blanket the stranger had used was still on the chair, but it was soaked, not with melted snow, but with something dark and sticky. Blood. Mary Ann screamed from the kitchen. Tom ran to her, finding her staring at the back door. It was wide open, snow blowing inside. On the floor was a trail of bloody footprints leading out into the storm. "Check the kids!" Mary Ann cried. Tom bolted upstairs. Sarah's bed was empty. The window was open, snow piling on the sill. Panicked, he ran to Jake's room. Jake was still in bed, but his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. "Jake!" Tom shook him, but the boy didn't respond. His small hand clutched a piece of paper. Tom pried it loose and unfolded it. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "One child for the storm. One child for the fire. I'll return for the rest." The police arrived hours later, but there was no trace of Sarah. The storm had wiped away the footprints, and no one could explain how the stranger had reached their isolated home. Jake eventually woke up, but he didn't remember anything. only that the man had smiled at him before disappearing. That Christmas morning, the Carters found a new stocking hanging from the mantel. It was old and tattered, and inside was a single item, a lock of Sarah's hair, tied with a red ribbon. The family moved away the following year, but the legend of the Christmas stranger grew. Locals say he only appears during the fiercest storms, always on Christmas Eve, seeking families to visit. Those who see him are marked, and he always returns to finish what he started. In 1987, the Whitaker family moved into a sprawling Victorian home on the outskirts of Newbury, Massachusetts. The house, over a century old, was a fixer-upper, but had an undeniable charm. It came fully furnished, including a dusty, forgotten attic filled with relics from the past. Among the cobwebbed trunks and moth-eaten curtains was a peculiar collection of antique porcelain dolls, neatly arranged on a shelf, each dressed in intricate holiday attire. Martha Whitaker, the family matriarch, found the dolls enchanting. "They're perfect for the holidays," she said, brushing the dust off their delicate faces. Her husband, Richard, and their teenage daughter, Emily, weren't as thrilled. Emily especially found their glassy, unblinking eyes unnerving. "They're creepy," Emily muttered. "They're staring at us." "Nonsense," Martha replied, placing them carefully on the fireplace mantel. "They're history. We'll decorate around them. It'll be beautiful." By mid-December, the Whitaker home was festively adorned. Garland wrapped the banisters, lights twinkled on the large pine tree, and the porcelain dolls were given prime positions throughout the living room. Each doll seemed to have its own personality. One with golden curls wore a tiny Santa hat, while another, with dark braids, carried a miniature gift box. Despite their cheerful appearances, Emily couldn't shake her unease. She swore their positions shifted slightly whenever she left the room. One evening, as the family watched a Christmas movie, Emily glanced at the mantel. One of the dolls, the one with the dark braids, seemed to be staring directly at her, though she was sure it had been facing the tree earlier. She shuddered and pointed it out to her parents. "They're just dolls," Richard said with a chuckle, though even he seemed uneasy. "Stop letting your imagination run wild." Emily scowled and decided to go to bed early. As she climbed the stairs, she could feel something watching her. Turning back, she saw the doll on the mantel. Its head was tilted now, ever so slightly, as if following her ascent. The first real incident happened a few nights later. Richard woke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft, tinkling laughter. He thought it was Emily playing a prank and got up to check. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the heater. When he passed the living room, he froze. One of the dolls had fallen off the mantel, but it wasn't broken. Instead, it was sitting upright on the floor, perfectly positioned, its tiny porcelain hand pointing toward the front door. Richard picked it up, shivering despite the warmth of the house. He placed it back on the mantel and went back to bed, dismissing it as his imagination. The next day, things escalated. Emily found tiny footprints in the snow outside her bedroom window, despite the second-floor height. Richard discovered scratches on the basement door, long and deep, as though something had been trying to claw its way out. And Martha swore she heard faint singing, an old Christmas carol, in a language she didn't recognize. When Emily tried to convince her parents to box up the dolls, Martha refused. "They're part of the house," she said firmly. "They've been here longer than we have." That night, Emily dreamed of the dolls. In her dream, they came alive, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. They surrounded her bed, their tiny mouths opening wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. When she woke, her bedroom door was ajar, though she was sure she'd closed it before sleeping. One of the dolls, the one with golden curls, was sitting on her desk, though it had been in the living room the night before. On Christmas Eve, the family hosted a small gathering with a few neighbors. The house was lively, filled with laughter and holiday cheer. For a moment, Emily felt like everything might be normal again. But as the guests admired the decorations, one elderly woman froze in front of the dolls. Where did you get these?" the woman stammered, her face pale. "They came with the house," Martha replied cheerfully. "Aren't they beautiful?" The woman shook her head, backing away. "You should get rid of them, now." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, frowning. The woman hesitated, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "This house, it belonged to the Wexler family. They lost their daughter, Margaret, one Christmas Eve over 50 years ago. She had a collection of dolls, just like these. After she died, the family said the dolls changed. They claimed they moved on their own, that they whispered to Margaret's younger siblings at night. The woman's voice trembled. One by one, the children disappeared. The parents were found dead in the attic, and the house has been empty ever since. Until you. Martha laughed nervously, but Richard and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. The woman refused to stay and left the party early. That night, as the family prepared for bed, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the howling wind outside seemed to grow louder. Richard went to check the breaker, leaving Martha and Emily in the living room with only the glow of the fireplace. The dolls, illuminated by the flickering flames, seemed more lifelike than ever. Emily swore one of them blinked. She grabbed it and threw it into the fireplace. The porcelain cracked, releasing a sharp, ear-piercing scream. The other dolls toppled from their perches, landing on the floor in a circle. Martha gasped as the remaining dolls began to move. They crawled toward the fire, their tiny hands clawing at the scorched remains of the burned doll. One by one, they turned to face Emily, their glassy eyes now glowing with a malevolent red light. Richard burst into the room, holding a flashlight. "What the hell is going on?" Before anyone could answer, the fireplace roared to life, flames shooting unnaturally high. The shadows of the dolls stretched along the walls, growing larger and more distorted. A guttural voice echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have disturbed us. This is our home, and now you will join us." The family fled into the storm, leaving the house behind. When they returned with the police the next day, the house was empty. The dolls were gone and the fireplace was cold, but etched into the soot were the words, "We will always be here." The Whitaker family never returned, and the house remains abandoned to this day. Some say that on Christmas Eve, you can still see tiny footprints in the snow around the property and hear faint, eerie laughter carried on the wind. In 1972, the sleepy town of Pine Hollow was known for its extravagant Christmas celebrations. Every year, the entire town would gather in the square to watch the lighting of a massive tree and welcome Kringle Claus, a local tradition said to honor the town's founding. The legend of Kringle Claus was peculiar. Unlike Santa, Kringle was a mysterious figure dressed in deep green robes, with a long white beard and piercing amber eyes. The story went that in the 1800s, Kringle had saved Pine Hollow from a harsh winter by leaving food and gifts on every doorstep. However, the legend came with a warning. If the town ever failed to welcome Kringle Claus properly, he would return, not to give, but to take. Over the years, the tale became more of a marketing gimmick than a genuine tradition. Kids lined up to take pictures with someone dressed as Kringle, and the town's businesses profited from the festivities. But in 1972, a blizzard struck unexpectedly on Christmas Eve, canceling the celebration for the first time in decades. The townsfolk thought nothing of it. After all, it was just a story. That night, strange things began to happen. The Marshalls, a family living on the edge of town, were the first to notice something odd. 11-year-old Danny woke up to the sound of jingling bells outside his window. Thinking it was Santa, he ran to look, but what he saw chilled him to the bone. Standing in the snow was a tall figure draped in green robes, its face obscured by the shadows of a hood. The figure held a crooked staff, and when Danny blinked, it was gone. Danny ran to his parents' room, but they assured him it was just a dream. Still, his mother, Helen, felt uneasy. As she tucked Danny back into bed, she noticed something strange on his windowsill. A single golden coin, engraved with the words, "One for Kringle." The next morning, Danny was gone. His bed was perfectly made, as though he'd never been there. The golden coin was still on the windowsill, now accompanied by a second message, "He belongs to me now." By mid-morning, word spread of other disappearances. In total, 5 children were missing, all from different parts of town. Each family found the same golden coin and message. The townsfolk were terrified, but the sheriff dismissed it as a cruel prank. "We'll find the kids," he assured the town. "It's just some lunatic taking advantage of the storm." That night, Helen heard the jingling bells again. This time, they were louder, closer. When she peeked out the window, she saw footprints in the snow leading toward the forest. Desperate to find Danny, she grabbed her coat and followed them, ignoring Richard's protests to stay inside. The snow was deep, and the storm howled through the trees. The footprints seemed to move with purpose, leading her deeper into the woods. She soon realized they weren't human. The impressions were too large, the toes elongated like claws. As Helen stumbled into a clearing, she saw it. An ancient stone altar, covered in frost. Around it stood the missing children, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes glowing faintly amber. In the center of the altar was the figure in green, Kringle Claus himself. His hood was down now, revealing a face that was ancient and otherworldly, his skin etched with lines like the bark of a tree. "You failed me," Kringle said, his voice echoing like the wind through the pines. "The offerings were forgotten, the songs left unsung. Now I take what I am owed." Helen screamed, running toward Danny, but an invisible force knocked her to the ground. Kringle raised his staff, and the glowing amber in the children's eyes grew brighter. "Please," Helen begged. "Take me instead. Leave the children alone." Kringle paused, tilting his head as if considering her words. Then, with a wave of his staff, the children collapsed into the snow. Helen scrambled to Danny, shaking him awake. He blinked up at her, confused but unharmed. When she looked back at Kringle, he was gone, but his voice lingered in the air. "The debt is not paid. I will return." The town's children were found the next morning, safe but unable to recall what had happened. The altar in the woods had disappeared, leaving no trace of its existence. But Helen knew the truth. Kringle Claus was real, and the town had broken its pact. The people of Pine Hollow resumed the tradition the next year, more elaborate than ever. But the curse was never fully lifted. Every few decades, when the town's devotion waned or a storm interrupted the celebration, children would disappear into the night, only to return with golden coins and vacant eyes. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the sound of jingling bells reminds Pine Hollow that Kringle Claus is always watching. It was Christmas Eve, and the small mountain town of Everfrost was cloaked in a blanket of fresh snow. Twinkling lights adorned the houses, and the smell of pine and baked goods wafted through the air. Carolers moved door to door, their harmonious voices filling the night. Jennifer, a writer with a penchant for solitude, had chosen to spend her holiday in a rented cabin at the edge of the woods. She had come to Everfrost to escape the bustling city and perhaps find inspiration for her next story. The cabin, quaint and cozy, had everything she needed: a crackling fireplace, a decorated Christmas tree, and shelves lined with books. Yet there was something about the woods that unsettled her. The trees seemed unnaturally still, their shadows long and twisted under the moonlight. She dismissed it as her imagination and settled in with a mug of hot cocoa. As midnight approached, Jennifer decided to take a short walk to clear her mind. The air was crisp, and the snow crunched beneath her boots. She ventured a little into the woods, marveling at the untouched beauty of the landscape. But the further she walked, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of branches, the call of an owl, were absent. Instead, there was a heavy, oppressive silence. Jennifer turned to head back to the cabin when she saw them. Footprints in the snow. They were large, too large to belong to a human, and they appeared fresh. Her heart quickened as she followed the trail with her eyes. The prints led deeper into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. A sudden, low humming sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, but grew louder, resonating through the trees. Jennifer froze, her breath visible in the cold air. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, a deep, guttural tone that seemed to come from all directions. She spun around, her flashlight illuminating the snow-covered ground. The footprints were gone, no sign of her own tracks either. Panic set in as she realized she was utterly lost. She began to run, her breaths coming in short gasps. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, and then it stopped. Out of the corner of her eye, Jennifer saw movement. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible. It was tall, its silhouette impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The creature's head tilted as if studying her, and then it stepped closer. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a pale mask, featureless except for hollow black eyes. Jennifer screamed and turned to flee, but the snow seemed to grab at her feet, slowing her down. She tripped and fell, her flashlight skidding away. In the dim light, she saw the creature's legs, jointed backward like a deer's, moving toward her with an eerie grace. Just as it loomed over her, everything went black. Jennifer awoke in her cabin, the morning sun streaming through the windows. She was on the floor near the fireplace, her body cold and stiff. Had it all been a dream? She looked down and saw her boots, still wet and caked with snow. Her flashlight was on the table, its batteries dead. As she sat there, trying to piece together the night, she noticed something strange. A single ornament hung from the Christmas tree, one she hadn't put there. It was made of wood, carved with intricate detail, and it depicted a tall, thin figure with hollow eyes. Underneath it, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a message: "You cannot escape the silent night." Jennifer's hands trembled as she read the words. She reached for the ornament, but the moment her fingers touched it, a cold shock ran through her body. The humming sound returned, faint and distant, as though it were coming from the woods. The cabin felt colder, and the warm, inviting fire in the hearth sputtered before extinguishing entirely. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen flickered, and then the device powered off completely. Her laptop, which had been charging on the desk, now displayed a single message on its dark screen: "Stay inside, or it will find you." A loud thud echoed from the roof, followed by the sound of scratching. Jennifer's heart raced as she stared at the ceiling, paralyzed with fear. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then moved to the windows. Someone was circling the cabin. The faint outline of a figure appeared at the window, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Desperate, Jennifer threw more wood into the fireplace and lit it again, hoping the light would keep whatever it was at bay. The flames roared to life, casting long shadows on the walls. But the figure didn't retreat. Instead, it pressed a hand, or what resembled a hand, against the glass, leaving behind an icy frost that began to spread inward. "Leave me alone!" Jennifer screamed, grabbing the poker from the fireplace. She swung it wildly, as if to ward off the presence. The humming intensified, vibrating through her skull, and the lights in the cabin flickered violently. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise ceased. The frost on the windows vanished, and the room fell silent. Jennifer collapsed to the floor, clutching the poker, her chest heaving. For a moment, she thought it was over. But when she looked at the tree, the ornament had changed. It now depicted her, a small figure huddled in terror beneath a towering, hollow-eyed creature. Beneath it, a new message had appeared: "This is only the beginning." Jennifer's screams echoed through the cabin as the humming began anew, louder and closer than ever before. The sound suddenly stopped. There was a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the still cabin. Jennifer's heart leaped into her throat. She edged toward the door, clutching the poker tightly. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Another knock, this time softer, almost hesitant. Jennifer peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Swallowing her fear, she opened the door just a crack. The cold wind rushed in, but the porch was empty. Only a single item lay on the snow-covered steps, a wrapped gift, tied with a blood-red ribbon. Against her better judgment, Jennifer picked it up and brought it inside. The box felt heavier than it looked. She unwrapped it with trembling hands, revealing a small music box. When she opened the lid, a hauntingly familiar melody began to play, a warped version of Silent Night. Inside the box was a tiny figurine of her cabin, complete with a flickering light in the window. As she stared, the light in the figurine's window went out. At that exact moment, the power in her cabin cut out, plunging her into darkness. Jennifer fumbled for her flashlight, her breaths coming in short gasps. The humming returned, louder than ever, and the music box continued to play on its own. Shadows danced around her, growing taller, stretching unnaturally. One shadow broke away from the rest, forming the outline of the creature with hollow eyes. The figure reached for her, its movements slow but deliberate. Jennifer screamed, backing into the corner. Just as it was about to touch her, the music box snapped shut and everything went silent. The power flickered back on. Jennifer looked around, her heart pounding. The music box was gone, as was the shadow, but the cabin's door was wide open, snow blowing inside. On the steps outside was a new ornament, This one showed her figure surrounded by dozens of hollow-eyed creatures, their hands reaching out for her. Beneath it was a chilling new message: see you next Christmas. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the dark corners of the holidays are where the real stories begin. Thanks for watching.